Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here from Munich, Germany, as we close the Munich Security Conference, the 62nd annual, in a very different environment for the Transatlantic Alliance. Look, I guess the big news was that the head of the largest ever U.S. delegation, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, gave a speech that was a lot friendlier in tone towards the Europeans and received a standing ovation. But I think that was a lot more about how much reduced European expectations for the transatlantic relationship are, and also how shell-shocked they were by J.D. Vance saying that the Europeans were the principal problem, even the principal enemy, those in the room, to the U.S. This was a speech that was much more about common interests, about needing to work together, about shared history. But of course, policy is a very different story. And there, the expectations are all about Europe. What are the Europeans going to do? How much more will they spend on defense? How quickly can they ramp up their capabilities as the Americans focus elsewhere in Asia, in the Western Hemisphere? And also, to what extent the Ukraine war can end and on whose terms? That conversation really dominated the last few days. President Zelensky from Ukraine here, almost all of the European leaders focused first and foremost on what can be done to try to bring the war to a sustainable close that doesn't lead the Russians to just rearm, regroup, have sanctions pulled off, but then attack again. Could the Americans actually provide a meaningful backstop? People are skeptical. Are the Europeans going to hold together if the Americans cut a deal with the Russians by themselves? People are skeptical. They think a lot of the Europeans from the South, for example, like Italy, like Spain, would be much less interested, while the frontline states like Poles, the Baltics, and the Nordics would be much more supportive. Putin understands all of that, and he understands the Ukrainians are under a lot more pressure than the Russians are, especially by President Trump himself, and that means that there's good reason for them to continue to fight despite the extraordinary number of casualties that they have been taken. That's probably the biggest issue that's been discussed here. But the second biggest issue is, can the Europeans become more competitive on other fronts? Can they get their economies to work, to become stronger and more effective, to fund that defense, but also to fund technology, to fund critical infrastructure? And on that front, there is a lot less confidence than there is on the support that they are providing to pay for weapons for Ukraine. Part of that is because Europe is 27 countries and they're institutionally hobbled from all acting together. They have 27 different electoral cycles. Many of those core leaders are weak. The French president is going to be out in a year. The British prime minister is likely to be out within weeks. And the German chancellor, although he's got a stronger run in terms of staying in power, also has a three-party coalition that is not particularly aligned in terms of how well they work together on policies, and certainly isn't prepared to provide support, economic support, fiscal support, to allow the rest of Europe to spend the way that the Germans are. So at the end of the day, you have a world where the transatlantic relationship continues to be dominated by the United States, which is one state, and the Europeans playing a subsidiary role, but they're 27. And as they step up economically, as they step up militarily, it's very hard for them to step up coherently and politically. And I think every European leader here, as much as they believe that they have identified the nature of the problem, they have not settled on the nature of a solution. So we close the Munich Security Conference on the same note that we entered it, which is an enormous amount of uncertainty and concern about the future of a transatlantic relationship that everyone has identified the problems with, but no one has come up with meaningful short-term solutions. See you again next February.